August 21st, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle was breathing again, thuek, wet, alive with the invisible rhythm of insects and distant surf. Private Jack Corcoran crouched low in the mud, sweat dripping into his eyes, his M1 slung across his chest. The air smelled of rot and cordite. Somewhere ahead, Japanese voices murmured confident, mocking, unhurried. The first weeks of the campaign had already taught the Marines that the island itself was an enemy: the heat, the rain, the dark green claustrophobia of it all. But tonight, what haunted them most wasn't the jungle. It was the laughter. The Japanese garrison had been taunting them for days, shouts across ravines, crude insults in broken English, and the occasional metallic echo of a Type 97 grenade clattering uselessly against the roots of a banyan tree. American Toy, one voice had shouted before the blast cracked open the night. The Marines had heard stories the Japanese called their grenades cherry blossoms, elegant and small, while mocking the Americans' thick, ridged Mech-2, a heavy segmented weapon they nicknamed Pineapple. It looked almost cartoonish, a fruit-shaped chunk of cast iron with a pin and a promise. The enemy thought it slow, unwieldy, too loud for real war. They hadn't yet seen what it could do in a place like this. Corcoran adjusted his grip, whispering to Sergeant Ben Rizzo beside him. 2 positions ahead, maybe 3. The sergeant nodded, barely visible under the canopy. The Marines had been clearing bunkers one by one. The method primitive but effective: listen for the chatter, crawl close, toss the Mk2 through a slit, and pray. But tonight, the enemy was dug in real fortifications, roofed with logs, fronted by a slit barely wide enough for a rifle barrel. The Type 97s bounced harmlessly off those walls. The Americans' grenades, with their 4-second delay and thick fragmentation pattern, might actually punch through. On 3, Rizzo whispered. He yanked the pin and counted, not aloud, but by instinct: 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. The pineapple left his hand in a low arc, vanishing into the darkness. The explosion came like a thunderclap, dull and heavy, the shockwave rolling through the jungle floor. Dirt, wood, and metal sang through the trees. Then, silence. When the smoke cleared, there was no laughter, just the creak of burning bamboo and the slow, sick hiss of rain on ash. By dawn, the Marines held the ridge. Rizzo stood over the crater that had been a machine gun nest, the twisted metal of a Type 92 still smoldering beneath the debris. "They'll stop laughing soon," he muttered. The Mk2 had done what rifles couldn't. It had reached into the earth itself and torn the fight out of it. Word spread fast among the battalions on Guadalcanal. The pineapple grenade wasn't pretty, but it was perfect for the island, where flamethrowers jammed and mortars couldn't aim. The Mk2 spoke in a language the jungle understood: short, violent, final. Its segmented body shattered into hundreds of jagged shards, slicing through palm trunks, helmets, and flesh alike. The Japanese had dug their bunkers deep, thinking they were safe. The grenade proved otherwise. In the weeks that followed, stories of its power became legend. Marines joked about it, even personalized it, painting little faces or carving initials into the metal. Some called it the Hand of God. Others, more grimly, just called it insurance. It was the weapon of the close fight, the weapon of men who didn't see their enemies until they could smell them. But on the other side of the jungle, Japanese soldiers were learning fast. Intelligence reports from captured diaries revealed their shock and fear. The Americans throw bombs like demons. One entry read, "Ours burst too softly, theirs tear through the trees." The Type 97's simple percussion cap design required it to be struck against a hard surface before throwing a fatal delay when seconds decided life and death. The Mk2's pull-pin fuse meant an American could hurl it blind into the dark and still count on it to detonate precisely on time. By September, the laughter had vanished entirely. Japanese officers ordered their men to capture the strange American grenades for study. In one battle, near the Matanikau River, a Marine squad found their own MiG-2s, repurposed, rolled back down hills, crudely refused, and thrown with trembling hands. None of them detonated properly. The captured designs were unfamiliar, the safety levers strange, the timing unpredictable. The same weapon that terrified them also betrayed them when they tried to copy it. The fighting on Guadalcanal turned into a brutal education. For both sides, every encounter was closer, dirtier, more desperate. In the dense foliage, rifles were nearly useless, machine guns jammed with mud. The grenade became the dominant voice of the battlefield. Marines learned to use it not just as a weapon, but as a signal two short blasts to mark a cleared position, one long to call for help. Each detonation was a sentence in the unspoken language of survival. And through it all, the enemy listened, deep in their dugouts. Japanese soldiers whispered about the pineapple bomb. Some believed it was magic that the Americans had found a way to make their weapons smarter, faster, angrier. Others simply accepted what they saw, that their once invincible jungle defenses were no match for this crude iron fruit from across the sea. When the Battle of Edson's Ridge came in mid-September, the Mk2 proved decisive. As waves of Japanese infantry surged uphill under moonlight, Marines waited until they could see the gleam of bayonets, then unleashed a rain of grenades. The explosions lit the ridge like lightning. Bodies vanished into fire and shadow, even as ammunition ran low. The Marines held their ground, fueled by discipline and the certainty that in close combat they had the better weapon. By dawn, the ridge was carpeted with the wreckage of one of Japan's finest night assaults. The laughter was gone. The myth of the weak American grenade had died in the mud of Guadalcanal. And the Marines, exhausted and filthy, realized they had just rewritten the rules of the Pacific War. October 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The airstrip was little more than a scar carved out of jungle and coral, a strip of clay so thin it could barely hold the weight of the C-47's landing supplies. Each day brought rain, rot, and the shriek of distant artillery. The Marines called it Cactus, after the island's code name, but it felt more like a graveyard waiting to happen. Amid the shattered palm trunks and burned-out trucks, rows of wooden crates sat beneath tattered tarps. They weren't marked with rations or ammunition. They were marked simply grenades. Fragmentation. MAC-2. Private First Class John Shorty Delano was on crate duty that morning, soaked to the bone, stacking pineapples like coconuts under the leaky canopy. The ordnance officers had warned them repeatedly, treat each crate like a live tiger. The humidity was brutal, the fuses temperamental, and yet somehow the weapon never failed when it mattered most. The older Marines treated the grenade with reverence, checking pins twice, fuses thrice. The younger ones joked, "She may look ugly, but she's got a temper like a redhead." It was gallows humor, the only kind that lasted out here. Across the perimeter, engineers were digging deeper trenches. Japanese shells landed daily now, probing the defenses around Henderson. The pattern was always the same. A few probing shots, then silence, then the whispers of movement and through the jungle. The enemy was learning to adapt, trading open charges for stealth and infiltration. That was when the grenade became not just a weapon, but a guardian. At night, every foxhole was lined with them, levers tucked neatly beneath fingers slick with sweat. The Marines began developing their own methods, unrecorded in any manual. Some tied grenades to tripwires strung between trees. Others buried them near paths and waited for the telltale snap of a twig. They learned to count the seconds in their sleep. to know instinctively when to throw and when to duck. For a generation of men raised on baseball, the motion was second nature, a wind-up, a release, a prayer. The sound of the spoon flying off was a signal burned into memory, forever. One night, a patrol led by Lieutenant Robert E. Dale was ambushed near the Ilu River. The Japanese had dug spider holes across the trail, tiny pits with soldiers crouched inside, knives ready. The first Marine disappeared with a muffled scream, dragged under. Dale didn't hesitate. He pulled a pin and dropped the grenade straight into the hole at his feet. The explosion lifted earth and flesh alike. When dawn came, the trail was lined with blackened roots and splintered helmets. Dale's report was brief and brutal. Enemy contact repelled. Grenades effective. Recommend increased supply. The ordnance supply officers took note. Soon, Marine logistics began shifting priorities: fewer mortar shells, more Mech-2s. Each division on Guadalcanal averaged 6 grenades per man, and still they asked for more. The Army, watching from afar, began taking notice too. By early 1943, the Mk2 was being shipped across the Pacific in staggering numbers from New Zealand to Bougainville, from Tarawa to Peleliu. Each island would learn the same lesson that the close, suffocating jungle belonged not to the rifleman, but to the man with the grenade. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Army Ordnance Bureau received fragments of an American grenade smuggled from the front. Engineers examined the casting under lamplight, tracing the ridges of the segmented shell. Too heavy. One technician remarked, "Too crude," said another. Yet when they replicated it in steel and tested it against sandbag walls, the result silenced the room. The shrapnel tore through every layer of canvas. They filed the report quietly, recommending immediate study of improved fragmentation design. But Japan's resources were stretched thin. Their factories were already rationing metal and fuel. The change never came. By contrast, American factories worked miracles. In Rock Island, Illinois, women in headscarves and overalls assembled Mech-2s by the millions. Each one was identical. Each fuse timed within fractions of a second. Newspapers called it the fruit of freedom. A bit of propaganda the Marines found darkly funny. They didn't see freedom when they threw it only a flash, a shockwave, and the awful quiet that followed. In the spring of 1943, the war moved north. The Marines, hardened and lean, carried their pineapples to New Georgia and Bougainville. The terrain changed little: the same choking green, the same rain, the same smell of death hiding beneath the soil. But now, they moved with a new kind of confidence. Every man knew what his grenade could do. Every enemy bunker looked smaller than before. On one ridge outside Munda, Japanese troops had carved an intricate network of tunnels beneath the limestone. Machine gun fire from the openings stalled every advance. Lieutenant Rizzo, the same grizzled sergeant from Guadalcanal, now promoted, took one look at the position and said simply, "Get me a box of pineapples." His squad spent the next 2 hours tossing grenades into every hole, counting the detonations like a metronome. When they finally entered, the tunnels were silent but for the crackle of fire. The entire strong point, once considered impregnable, had been wiped out without a single artillery round. By mid-1943, the Japanese command finally acknowledged it. The American fragmentation grenade had become one of the most decisive infantry weapons in the Pacific. Reports described it as indiscriminate and terrifying, ideal for annihilation of defensive positions. The irony was sharp: the same weapon once mocked as an over-designed curiosity was now rewriting the doctrine of jungle warfare. And yet, for all its power, the Mk2 was also deeply personal. It wasn't like a rifle or a tank. It required touch, timing, nerve. The difference between victory and death was 4 seconds, and the courage to hold until the last possible heartbeat. Every Marine knew men who'd miscounted. Every platoon had stories whispered over cigarettes about grenades that came back too soon, or fuses that burned too fast. The weapon gave, and it took away. That duality defined the Pacific War itself, brutal, intimate, fought at distances so small you could feel the enemy's breath. In those moments, the MAC-2 was more than iron. It was survival, vengeance, and the grim arithmetic of progress, and somewhere deep in the jungle, where the trees still bore shrapnel scars from old battles, the laughter of those who once mocked it had long since faded into the soil. July 30th, 1943, New Georgia Island, Central Solomons. The sun hadn't broken the horizon yet, and already the jungle was choking on its own heat. Marines of the 169th Regiment were moving single file through knee-deep mud, the air filled with the low whine of mosquitoes and the distant rumble of Japanese mortars. Somewhere ahead, a line of pillboxes cut across a narrow ridge, a fortified position locals called the Dragon's Spine. Every attempt to take it by rifle and bayonet had failed. The men had learned the same grim truth the hard way: bullets vanished in foliage. But fragments found everything. Sergeant Dale, now a veteran of Guadalcanal, adjusted his belt. 6 grenades hung from it like heavy fruit. The brass pins gleamed dully in the half-light. No more warning shots, he said quietly to his squad. We're going to burn them out. He moved with the calm of someone who had long ago made peace with chaos. The plan was simple. Crawl close. Use the pineapples to clear each log bunker, then signal for the engineers to follow. No shouting, no heroics, just patience and the cold precision of repetition. When the first grenade went off, it didn't sound like an explosion. It sounded like a deep inhale, a thunderous breath drawn from the earth itself. Shrapnel hissed through ferns, splintering bark, shredding everything that moved. Within minutes, the jungle echoed with overlapping blasts. The Japanese defenders, pinned in their trenches, tried to respond with their Type 97s, but the difference in sound was unmistakable. Theirs popped. The Americans roared. By dawn, the ridge was silent except for the buzz of flies. The Dragon's Spine was broken, and the Marines advanced. As reports filtered back to headquarters, officers began to formalize what had been learned by instinct. Manuals were rewritten. In jungle warfare, fragmentation grenades shall be considered the primary infantry assault weapon. Training films were shot in Hawaii, showing proper throwing techniques, fuse timing, and how to use grenades in concert with flamethrowers. What had once been improvisation was now doctrine. The MAC-2 was no longer a sideshow, it was a symbol of adaptation, proof that even in the most primitive battles, engineering and psychology could decide victory. Meanwhile, the Japanese army clung to older tactics. Their soldiers still prized the sword and the bayonet, the rush of the final charge. On the night of August 6th, during the counterattack at Bairoko Harbor, hundreds of Japanese infantry stormed the marine perimeter under moonlight, shouting banzai. The sound was inhuman, part fury, part despair. But the Marines didn't flinch. They waited until the charging figures were barely 20 yards away. Then, the jungle lit up again, with the rolling, concussive rhythm of grenades. The first wave disintegrated. The second stumbled over the bodies of the first. By sunrise, the battlefield was a scar of smoke and silence. The Americans counted hundreds of enemy dead and barely a dozen of their own. It was there, among the twisted palms and cratered soil, that the Marines began to understand the psychological power of their weapon. The MAC-2 didn't just kill it unnerved. Its delay, fuse hissed audibly in those last seconds before detonation, a sound that spread panic through enemy ranks. Japanese survivors spoke later of that whispering fuse, describing it as the devil breathing. In letters intercepted by Allied intelligence, Soldiers begged for better grenades or deeper bunkers. One note, recovered near Kolombangara, read simply, "They throw thunder." By late 1943, production of the Mk2 had surpassed 10 million units, from Pittsburgh to Des Moines. Assembly lines worked around the clock. Women inspectors polished fuse housings with cloth and oil, stamping each with the date and factory code. Some even tucked tiny notes into the crates. "Come home safe." Boys. Those crates would travel 12,000 miles to a jungle trench, where a Marine might read the message seconds before pulling the pin. It was an invisible thread connecting two worlds, one of sweat and steel, the other of mud and fear. As the war expanded across the Pacific, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, the grenade remained a constant companion. In every assault, every cave, every shattered hill, its voice was the same. The Marines learned to feel time differently because of it. 4 seconds wasn't just fuse delay. It was the heartbeat of survival. 1. Breathe. 2. Count. 3. Release. 4. Silence. Each throw was an act of faith that the timing was right, that the pin was clear, that the man next to you would duck when you did. On Tarawa in November 1943, that faith was tested beyond reason. The beach was a killing field. Bodies tangled in barbed wire, water slick with fuel and blood. Japanese defenders in concrete bunkers poured machine gun fire into the shallows. Rifles jammed with sand. Communication broke down. The assault began to stall until a handful of Marines crawled forward with sacks of grenades strapped to their backs. They used the blast not just to kill, but to create openings, carving holes in seawalls and air vents in the bunkers. For every explosion, another few feet gained. One officer later wrote, "Without those grenades, we'd still be on that beach." Each battle made the weapon's legacy heavier. The MK2 was simple, brutal, and utterly democratic. It required no special training, no complex machinery. It asked only for courage, the willingness to hold fire in your hand. It blurred the line between man and machine, turning every soldier into his own artillery. And as the Americans advanced, island by island, the Pineapple became an emblem of unstoppable momentum, small, unassuming, yet capable of reshaping empires. When word of these battles reached Japan, some officers dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Others, quietly, began to worry. Their empire had been built on the assumption of moral superiority and technical parity. Now, both were in doubt. If something as ordinary as a hand grenade could tilt the balance, what did that say about the war itself? The answer would come soon on Saipan, where the full force of American ingenuity met the last reserves of Japanese fanaticism. There, the MK2 would not only break fortresses, but also expose a deeper truth about the nature of this war, that victory was no longer a matter of glory or honor, but of industry, science, and the cold, mechanical rhythm of progress. June 15, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The horizon burned red as dawn broke over the Pacific. LSTs groaned in the surf, steel doors yawning open to release the men of the 2nd Marine Division. The sea was calm, deceptively so, and the island ahead looked almost beautiful. Green ridges rising into mist, white sand curling like lace along the bay. But beneath that beauty, Saipan was ready. Japanese guns, hidden in caves and coral bunkers, waited, their barrels already aimed at the approaching waves. Corporal Vincent Harland adjusted the strap on his helmet and checked the 6 grenades clinking against his belt. He had carried them through Tarawa and Eniwetok, each scar on his arm a reminder of what the Pineapple could do to the enemy, and sometimes to those who held it too long. As his landing craft lurched forward, he could smell the sharp sting of diesel and salt. Around him, the men were silent. They all knew what was waiting in the jungle beyond the beach. When the ramp dropped, the world turned white. Machine gun fire ripped through the surf, cutting men down before they reached the sand. Harlan dove forward, the water exploding behind him. The air was thick with smoke, sand, and screams. He crawled past bodies and shattered rifles, pulling a grenade from his belt with shaking hands. He bit the pin free, counted to 3, and threw. The blast tore open a nest of machine guns 50 yards up the beach. The Marines surged forward behind the Echo, shouting through the chaos. By noon, the first wave had carved a foothold, but every inch was paid for in blood. The Japanese had transformed Saipan into a labyrinth of tunnels, interlinked bunkers, and hidden chambers carved into volcanic rock. It was a fortress of the earth itself. Artillery couldn't reach them. Flamethrowers couldn't always burn deep enough. The grenade, once again, became the key. For days, the fighting devolved into a subterranean nightmare. Marines crawled on their stomachs through dark tunnels, tossing grenades ahead before daring to move another foot. The explosions were deafening in the confined spaces, bursts of light and noise that left ears bleeding and lungs burning. After each blast, silence would fall, broken only by the drip of water and the faint groans of those still alive. Then another pin would pull, another fuse hiss. Harlan remembered one cave in particular, near Mount Tapocho. Intelligence said 30 Japanese soldiers were hiding inside, armed with rifles and bayonets. The entrance was narrow. Only one man could fit at a time. They didn't try to storm it. Instead, the Marines surrounded it and spent the next half hour feeding grenades into the dark, one after another, until the echoes stopped. When they finally entered, what remained was unrecognizable. Harlan later said, "It was the first time I understood what total war meant. You couldn't see the enemy's face, just hear the end of him." The MiG-2 had become more than a tool. It was a psychological weapon. The Japanese soldiers began to fear its sound more than rifle fire. Some refused to stay in bunkers once they heard the spoon fly. Others turned their own grenades inward rather than wait for the inevitable. The Americans, hardened by 2 years of jungle fighting, moved with mechanical precision, pull, count, throw, repeat. It wasn't bravery anymore. It was muscle memory. But Saipan wasn't just another island. It was Japan's last line of defense before the homeland itself. As the Marines advanced inland, the civilians, farmers, families, even children were caught in the storm. Many were told by their commanders that the Americans would torture or kill them. When the fighting reached the cliffs of Marpi Point, hundreds of civilians threw themselves into the sea. Harlan stood among the rocks, his hands still blackened from soot, and watched as the bodies disappeared beneath the waves. The same weapon that had protected him for 2 years suddenly felt unbearably heavy on his belt. In the aftermath of Saipan, American commanders took stock. The grenade had proven indispensable, but it had also revealed the cost of such warfare, a campaign of annihilation fought yard by yard. Reports from the island listed over 29,000 Japanese dead, many in their bunkers, killed by fragmentation. For the Marines, victory no longer felt like triumph. It felt like survival. Back in the United States, propaganda posters showed smiling soldiers tossing grenades like baseballs. The pineapple power of America's fighting men. The reality, though, was different. Every Marine who'd thrown one carried ghosts, the smell of smoke, the feel of shrapnel dust on skin, the faint ticking of a fuse that sometimes echoed in dreams. By late 1944, the Mk2 had become so iconic that it appeared in every field manual, every photograph, every cinematic newsreel. It represented American ingenuity, cast iron turned into dominance. Yet to the men who lived it, the weapon was something far more primal. It was the sound of 4 seconds of faith, the shape of desperation, the line between victory and oblivion. And as the Pacific War marched toward its final, fiery crescendo on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the MK2 would meet its greatest test yet, where the enemy would fight not from bunkers or trenches, but from the very earth itself. There, on volcanic ash and broken rock, the Pineapple would no longer just tear through jungle fortresses. It would carve its name into history, one explosion at a time. February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The ocean was black glass beneath a gray sky. From the decks of the assault ships, the men could already smell the sulfur, a thick, burning stench that clung to their uniforms before they even landed. For days, naval guns had pounded the island, shaking it to its volcanic core, but as the landing craft closed in, not a single enemy shot came in return. It was too quiet, too still. The veterans knew what that meant. When the ramps fell, the silence shattered. Hidden machine guns erupted from the slopes of Mount Suribachi, turning the black sand into a storm of bullets. Marines threw themselves flat, rifles useless in the soft ash. It absorbed everything: shells, shrapnel, even footsteps. Sergeant Rizzo, his hair now more gray than black, led his squad out off the beach with one word: move. They crawled forward, inch by inch, toward an unseen enemy buried deep in a honeycomb of tunnels and bunkers. The MK2 grenade hung heavy on every belt. Here, more than anywhere else, it would decide life and death. The Japanese defenders, 21,000 men under Lieutenant General Kuribayashi, had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress beneath the ground. Every hill was a bunker. Every ridge hid a network of tunnels. The Marines' rifles couldn't reach them. Artillery couldn't break them. The only way was to crawl close enough to drop a grenade inside and pray you didn't get pulled in with it. By midday, the beach was chaos. Medics dragged the wounded through craters filled with seawater and blood. Tanks bogged down in the volcanic sand. The air was thick with cordite and ash. In one crater, a young Marine named Ellis Turner fumbled for his grenade after a sniper's shot grazed his arm. The pin slipped, the fuse hissed, and instinct took over. He hurled it toward the nearest cave mouth and dropped flat. The explosion came a second later, muffled but final. When he lifted his head, the sniper's fire had stopped. The fighting moved underground. The Marines entered caves on hands and knees, flashlights trembling, the heat unbearable. Each one was its own hell-narrow passages where shadows hid men waiting with bayonets, grenades, or worse. They learned to fight like miners of death throw. Duck, listen. If they heard screams, they moved forward. If they didn't, they threw another. Some Marines carried satchel charges, 20 pounds of TNT, but for most, the MR2 remained the weapon of choice. It was small enough to carry dozens, simple enough to use in the dark, and deadly enough to clear what artillery could not. In one sector near the northern airfield, Rizzo's platoon was pinned by machine guns firing from interlocking pillboxes. The only way through was to crawl up under the field of fire. Grenade by grenade. Rizzo and two others spent hours moving 10 yards at a time, pulling pins with their teeth. Timing throws by instinct. Each blast cracked open another bunker. When they finally broke through, the platoon had lost half its men, but the line was open. Rizzo stood at the edge of the last crater, ash sticking to his face, and muttered, "That's how you break a mountain." For the Japanese, it was a nightmare with no end. Each grenade that rolled into their tunnels meant a few more seconds of terror: the fuse, hiss, the echoing thump, the splinters of light. Survivors described the sound as the island breathing death. Yet even in the face of annihilation, they refused to surrender. They adapted, tossing American grenades back, setting traps, or lying still among the dead to strike when Marines passed by. But the Americans adapted faster. They began double-fusing grenades, setting them to detonate sooner, leaving no time for return. By March, Iwo Jima was an open wound. The nights glowed orange with fire, the air reeking of burnt flesh and sulfur. Marines slept with grenades under their chests, using them as alarms, a cruel necessity in a war where the enemy crept back through tunnels at night. The constant detonations became the heartbeat of the island. Every 4 seconds, another blast, somewhere in the distance, marking another cave sealed, another life ended. When Mount Suribachi finally fell, it wasn't because of the flag raised at its summit. It was because hundreds of grenades had turned its tunnels into tombs. The men who climbed that mountain didn't see glory. They saw smoke rising from the holes where their friends had vanished. Below them, the ground trembled with the last explosions. Even after the flag went up, the killing didn't stop. For weeks, pockets of Japanese resistance held out in the northern ravines. It was there, in those final days, that the grenade showed both its genius and its curse. A weapon of simplicity that had outlived its inventors. It demanded one last act of courage from men who had nothing left to give. Many Marines threw their final grenades and then slumped in exhaustion, too numb to watch what came after. When the battle finally ended in March 1945, over 20,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, most entombed in the earth, killed by fragmentation and flame. Nearly 7,000 Americans were gone too. Iwo Jima had been conquered not by numbers or strategy, but by endurance, by men with 4 seconds of steel courage in their hands. As survivors boarded ships for the next campaign, some turned their grenades in, others kept one as a grim souvenir. They were told the war wasn't over, that Okinawa awaited, and they knew what that meant. More tunnels, more screams, more pineapples. The weapon that had once been mocked was now the most trusted ally a Marine could have. Ahead lay the last great battle and the final proof of what the Mk2 grenade, and the men who carried it, could endure. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands. Easter Sunday dawned gray over the East China Sea. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War was underway, more than 1,400 ships, 500,000 men, and a coastline that would soon become synonymous with hell itself. The Marines and Army troops moving toward Okinawa didn't yet know that this island, only 350 miles from Japan's mainland, would consume nearly 3 months of their lives. What they did know, what every man understood deep in his bones, was that this would not be another quick island hop. The enemy had nowhere left to run. Private Ellis Turner, the same quiet farm boy who'd survived Iwo Jima, crouched in the well of a landing craft with his hands resting on 6 Make-2 grenades. The brass was already dull from salt air, the grooves packed with sand from battles past. He had stopped counting how many he'd thrown since Guadalcanal. Maybe 50, maybe 100. Every one had felt like the same heartbeat. 4 seconds between life and death. As the craft slammed into the surf, Turner jumped into knee-deep water. For the first time, there was no resistance, no gunfire, no artillery. The Japanese waited. The men advanced inland cautiously, eyes scanning the hills. Within hours, they found out why it had been so quiet. The first ambushes erupted near Kakazu Ridge, and the slopes above Shuri Castle turned into killing grounds. The Japanese defenders had learned. This time, their bunkers weren't crude pits or palm log shelters. They were carved into limestone cliffs, reinforced with concrete, and connected by tunnels that stretched for miles. Each one was designed to survive bombardment and to make the Americans fight for every inch with grenades. Artillery couldn't touch them. Tanks couldn't reach them. It was the same grim equation as Iwo Jima, magnified 100-fold. For the next 90 days, Okinawa became a war of caves. Marines and Army infantry fought not against armies, but against the earth itself, crawling into holes, tossing grenades into darkness, and listening to the echoes. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burned limestone. The explosions never stopped. Each one marked another sealed bunker, another name lost to the mud. Sergeant Rizzo, now battle-hardened beyond recognition, led a squad near Sugarloaf Hill. The fighting there lasted a week, though time meant nothing anymore. He'd seen every kind of death the Pacific could offer. But Okinawa was different. It was slower, closer. The enemy didn't flee. They waited. You didn't fight men. He later told a war correspondent, you fought the ground. The damn ground shot back. His men carried bags of grenades, 50 pounds each, and passed them like ammunition belts, one explosion at a time. At night, the battlefield glowed red with tracer fire and embers from shattered villages. Rain turned everything to clay. The Marines slept in shell holes, clutching their grenades under their chests. Sometimes, they woke to find Japanese infiltrators crawling among them, knives glinting in the rain. There was no warning, no safety. Only reflex, a quick pull, a short throw, a flash that left everything white and silent. By mid-May, Okinawa was a charnel house. Civilians hid in the same caves as soldiers, terrified and starving. The Marines tried to coax them out, shouting through interpreters, offering food, anything to end the madness. But fear ruled the island. Entire families died by their own hands rather than surrender. For many Americans, it was the first time they realized this war could not be won by courage alone, only by exhaustion. The MK2 grenade remained their constant companion. Its body was chipped and blackened, its paint worn off by mud and blood. But it never failed. Even the veterans began to see it as something almost human, a trusted comrade. Old and ugly, but unbreakable. Each man developed his own rituals, tapping the pin twice, counting aloud under his breath, whispering a name before throwing. In a world stripped of everything sacred, these small acts kept them sane. When the rains came in June, the island turned into a sea of filth. Dead men, twisted trees, and broken helmets floated together in rivers of mud. The fighting near Shuri Castle reached its climax. Caves collapsed under tons of TNT, and the once proud Japanese fortifications perished in clouds of black dust. Turner's platoon advanced through the ruins, the ground trembling beneath their boots. In one shattered tunnel, they found the body of a Japanese officer clutching an American MK2. The pin was still in place. His final act had been to try to understand it. That moment, Turner later said, broke something inside him. All this time, he told a corpsman, we thought we were fighting men who hated us, but maybe they were just scared of what we'd built. He didn't mean the grenade. He meant the machine, the endless, tireless machinery of American war that could turn something as small as a handful of metal into victory. By June 22nd, the island was declared secure. Nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. 12,000 Americans had fallen. Okinawa had taken more lives than any other battle in the Pacific and left both sides shattered. In Washington, strategists already looked ahead to the next step, the invasion of Japan itself. They knew what awaited them: more tunnels, more caves, more desperate defenders. But something else was coming. Something that would render even the Make-2 obsolete. The men who left Okinawa didn't know it yet, but they had fought the last great grenade war in history. The next weapon America would unleash would make even the pineapple's fury seem small. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan. At 8:15 a.m., the sky split open. A single bomb small enough to fit inside a B-29's bay did what millions of grenades and shells could not. The city vanished beneath a column of light. 70,000 souls were erased in seconds. Their shadows burned into the streets where they had once stood. For the Marines who'd fought across the Pacific. The news came days later, whispered through the ranks like a ghost story. At first, many didn't believe it. How could one bomb destroy an entire city they'd spent years clawing through inches of jungle and stone, trading grenades for yards of dirt? Now the war was ending with a single flash. Corporal Ellis Turner was aboard the USS Hawking when the radio crackled with the announcement. The ship was en route to prepare for the invasion of Kyushu, an operation that promised to cost millions of lives. The men cheered when they heard Japan might surrender. But the sound felt hollow. Turner sat on the deck with a cigarette and one last Mach-2 grenade in his hand. The paint rubbed off, the metal smooth from months of handling. He thought of Guadalcanal, of Iwo, of Okinawa, of the faces that had vanished 4 seconds at a time. The idea that the war could end not with a scream but with silence felt almost impossible. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. Then, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice, the first many Japanese had ever heard, echoed across a stunned nation, announcing surrender. For the men of the Pacific, it was over. The pineapple that had been their closest friend, their last resort, was suddenly just a relic of a war the world already wanted to forget. When the Marines came home, they brought them back as souvenirs. Some painted them gold, turned them into lamps or paperweights. Others buried them deep in attics, unable to look at the jagged shell that had taken so many lives. On parade grounds. The MKEK-2 was replaced by newer designs, smoother, simpler, safer. The fruit basasir that had once been mocked by the enemy, feared by the jungle, and trusted by every man who carried it, faded quietly into museums and display cases. But its legacy remained. The grenade had changed how wars were fought, how soldiers thought about distance, cover, fear. It had made combat intimate again, personal, measured not in miles but in meters, not in artillery barrages but in the space between 2 heartbeats. And it had taught a brutal lesson that echoed long after the war ended. Technology alone didn't win battles. The will to endure did. In post-war Japan, former soldiers told their own stories of caves collapsing, of the earth shaking, of the strange American weapon that hissed before it killed. They remembered the sound more than the sight, the way the jungle held its breath before the blast. To them, it was not just a weapon, but a symbol of inevitability of a war that could no longer be won through spirit or sacrifice. Decades later, in interviews and memoirs, veterans from both sides would speak of the Mk2 with the same mixture of awe and dread. It was the weapon of proximity, the equalizer between men who never saw each other's faces. The Marines who had once joked about pineapples for breakfast grew quiet when asked about it. They remembered the sound, that dry metallic snap, the spoon flicking away, followed by the longest 4 seconds in the world. History would reduce it to a footnote, overshadowed by the atomic age that followed, but for those who had lived it, the grenade was more than iron and powder. It was the heartbeat of their war, the pulse of every ambush, every clearing, every desperate charge through mud and fire. It had turned the vast Pacific, with all its jungles and beaches and cliffs, into a series of small, enclosed worlds, each one defined by a single shattering explosion. In the years that followed, Sergeant Rizzo retired quietly to a farm in Ohio. He kept one Mk2 locked in a drawer in his barn, its pin still in place. Every so often, he'd take it out, turn it in his hand, and stare at it like an old photograph. To him, it wasn't a trophy or a weapon. It was a memory of men who had stood together in the dark and trusted 4 seconds to carry them home. And for Ellis Turner, who lived long enough to see the world change again through Korea, Vietnam, the moon landing, and the cold silence of the nuclear age, the grenade became something else entirely. When his grandson once asked him what it was like to fight in the Pacific, Turner didn't talk about glory or victory. He simply held up the old Mac-2, its surface pitted and scarred, and said, "This little thing, this is what the war sounded like." He set it down on the table. The light caught the grooves in its metal, the faint glint of the safety pin still holding everything together. Then he leaned back, exhaled, and added softly, "And thank God it never had to go off again."